All right, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and I'm very excited to see you guys all here today. I know it's the very first talk in the morning, so hopefully the coffee is starting to work, and you can take out the most from this talk. So we are here on the bounty track, so really we're all kind of interested in bug bounty hunting, bounty research. It's a very different kind of space, I think, a very unique space as compared to cybersecurity research, right? Because cybersecurity research focuses on a lot of different domains, from malware to reverse engineering, and of course to offensive security. But I think bug bounty has a special place, a very unique place. It requires a different set of skills, a different set of approaches, and also, a bit more practical stuff that hopefully you can also use in your day-to-day bounty today. So, I've already had a fantastic introduction, but I'm Eugene, and I come from Singapore, a very small country, about 5 hours away. My username is spaceraccoon online, and I do have a blog, spaceraccoon.dev, so hopefully you can check that out. And I also have a Twitter, so someone's already taken Space Raccoon on Twitter, so if you're that guy, come up to me and we'll try to work something out. I have to use spaceraccoonsec in the meantime. So why automate, right? I think in the bug bounty space, a lot of people like to share about automation, I found a bug in 1 minute or something like that, right? A lot of people use recon, a lot of people use wide scope stuff. But for me, I think my bug bounty journey mostly involved manual hunting. I tried to get a server, I tried to run, FFuff and the subdomain enumeration, but I got bored of it over a while because I wasn't very good at it, right? I started my journey in January 2019, and I focused a lot on the basic fundamental bugs like IDOR, business logic, XSS, and my first bounty was at about 2 months later in February 2019, where I got an IDOR, and that got me started in the bug bounty journey. And at the end of the year, I went to H1213, which was a HackerOne live hacking event with US Air Force, Yahoo, and the UK Ministry of Defense. And I was able to get the Most Valuable Hacker Award, mostly through these manual bugs. And then I mostly focused on a large number of programs and bugs, because back then I hadn't started a full-time job. So I had a lot of time to hack, a lot of time to just do manual stuff. And so I had a high volume of bugs and research. And then I entered the global all-time top 100 by March 2020, about a year later. So what has changed, right? Today is 2022, right? And I've mostly moved on towards more native vulnerabilities, reverse engineering, and code review. So a bit more in-depth research. And in January 2020, fortunately I was, not 2020, I guess, 2021, I was recognized with the H1 Elite Hall of Fame. But really, in terms of my focus with bug bounty these days, I focus a lot on selective programs with high impact. So I try to avoid programs with maximum 1,000 or 3,000 bounties. I try to go for high impact because I don't have a lot of time, right? I have a full-time job. I can only do it on my weekends maybe, and on the weekends you want to see your friends, your family. So I don't have a lot of time. So I try to keep it as focused as possible on very high impact, but also high bounty programs. And today I'm still in the global top 40. All-time top 40, but I'm not really farming rep anymore. I don't think I'll stay in the top 100 or even top 500 for very long, because things are very competitive, and if you have a high volume of bugs, that's going to get you the reputation to be in the top rankings. But for me, that's what works for me, and I kind of want to help other people who are in the same situation, who are focusing a lot on manual hunting, but might not have a lot of time. So in the long run, I think in the bug bounty space, I've observed that a lot of hunters tend to fall into two camps, right? Automation or manual, right? The automation guys, they have huge number of servers. They do a lot of reconnaissance. They do a lot of services. They have scanners, signatures. Whereas for manual, you really want to focus on a single scope, right? You stay in the scope. You don't care about wildcard, star scope. You just want to focus on one application. And this means that instead of looking for signatures, you look at heuristics. You look at interesting behavior, where you, as a human, because you're best at a certain kind of class of stuff, such as context, and looking for more interesting bugs, that's what you're going to look at. And there's actually a lot of overlaps between these two approaches, right? Because at the end of the day, for bug bounty, you have 3 big steps. You do some reconnaissance, you work on testing the application, and then you exploit it. And for reconnaissance, you can automate a lot of that. You can do subdomain enumeration. Whereas for a manual bug bounty hunter, you really want to focus on exploring the app functionality. You want to test the app, go deep, right, rather than go wide. And when you're testing the bugs, for those who are automating it, they can actually just use like nuclei or like different signatures. And then they, of course, do some automated exploitation, right? I know people who do automated subdomain takeovers, and that's a very easy thing to exploit. Whereas for manual hunters, of course, that gives you a bit of difficulty because you want to work on your own custom payloads, your exploitation, and your pivots. But as a manual hunter, because everything, you got a hammer, everything looks like a nail, you kind of think, oh, I should just use browser and burp, right? But that's not ideal in the long run because it's time intensive, it's inconsistent, it's inefficient, and more importantly, it's boring, right? You want to make bounties, but you want to do it in an interesting way. And in the meantime, I think the free tools that are available for you have increased in quantity and quality. A lot of the big tech companies out there, from Google, Microsoft, they're starting to release really interesting tools, right? For fuzzing, you got Cluster Fuzz. Microsoft has Wrestler, which is a REST API fuzzer. For mobile, ByteDance recently released AppShark, which focuses on taint tracking within Java Node Android applications. Of course, you have MobSF, which is more of a SAST kind of tool. For SAST, you have SamGraph and CodeQL. These are kind of the more popular modern code scanner tools today. And this helps manual hunters focus on triage and exploitation, right? Because instead of spending all your time doing repeated things, just move that into the automation pipeline. So for recon, you can automate the attack surface mapping for yourself, but then you manually define the search sources, right? Because, for example, when you're deep within an app, you can find stuff such as special AWS roles that they're using to run that app. And for testing, rather than testing every single endpoint yourself, you pass that on to API fuzzer that will help you triage interesting behavior, and then you follow up yourself. And of course, for exploit, there's automation payload generation, but you should be writing those scripts yourself. And the most important thing here is that as a manual hunter, your focus should be on differentiating yourself from automation and recon hunters, right? Like those guys, they're running huge server farms, they automate the exploits, they even automate the reporting. So how are you going to outrun them, right? Unless you have your own custom signature. And a lot of times people get frustrated because you get a lot of duplicates just by running the same thing over and over again. So what's really important here is that you focus on what makes you unique as a manual hunter. And that is your ability to contextualize an application and to find things that a machine can't really find through a scanner, right? Things that require authorization, automation, authentication, as well as looking deeper into an application. So just to sum it up quickly, what I mean by that is that automation for manual hunters uses a different set of tools and workflows from standard automation. And I think the Portugal guys, when they released the \powered scanner, they had a pretty good insight into that, right? Rather than scanning for vulnerabilities, you need to scan for interesting behavior. And having identified the outputs from that, then it's time to pass it on to you, the human, right, to make sense of that. And back then, \powered scanning was interesting because it was an injection-focused scanner. So it's a very small domain of hunting in a hacking application. So hopefully the rest of this talk, instead of just focusing on one part of injection, rather than just the testing phase, I can show you how in different parts of this entire workflow of a bug bounty hunter, you can also add this form of automation that is useful and focused for manual bug bounty hunters. Okay, so let's think about recon, right? As a recon, I think bug bounty hunters, when you first started out, I loved star scopes, right? I love wildcard scope. I didn't want to just spend it on one single website. I wanted to look at the whole subdomains of a company because that gave me more chances of finding a bug. But these days, I think about it very differently. Even within a single app, there's a lot of recon that you can do internally to unpack. So firstly, you have the client-side source code. So this is a JavaScript that appears on the application, whether it's a mobile or web. Then there's the API enumeration and introspection. These days, there are a lot of frameworks that allow you to introspect the entire API rather than trying to, just using the app and then figure out what is called from the app. Thirdly, there's cloud and software as a service integrations. So they're very interesting stuff. I've done some research on, for example, ngrok. I've done some research on Amazon simple notification services. Those are on my blog as well. But these are interesting integrations that you can check out as well and exploit because you're not exploiting the third-party software as a service. You're attacking the integration with the application. And finally, there's some reverse engineering. And I think this is something that more bug bounty hunters need to do. It has given me some bugs that people will never find because I think reverse engineering is a very underrated skill. but I'll talk about that later. So client-side code, right? So usually when you browse an application these days, unfortunately or fortunately, most of them are going to be written in React, right? And React is going to be a very packed kind of code. But within this code, you're going to see a lot of interesting things, right? You're going to see the APIs, the endpoints, so you can look at the production and development environments. Development environments, of course, they are maybe a little less protected. They might share secrets or encryption keys between development and production. This is, I think this is an underutilized bug that more people should look for. And then you have secrets, credentials, encryption, stuff like that. I think that's pretty clear. And then, of course, the integrations, which I'll talk about more later. But one-to-one decompilers are key, because if you're looking at a React app, they're going to be Webpack. So it's going to be very obfuscated, very complicated code. It's very hard for you to read. So when you look at React, fortunately, there are a lot of easy decompilers you can use these days. If you have the source map, you should use a source map decompiler. I wrote a tool, Webpack Exploder, but there are a lot of other tools that do that for you as well. For Electron apps, you should be looking at ASA if they use that to pack their app. There are other ways to pack an Electron app, but basically it's JavaScript. It should, it's packed, but it should go back into JavaScript, right? WebAssembly binary toolkit. So nowadays more applications in JavaScript are moving towards WebAssembly, which is kind of a bytecode binary representation of JavaScript. You can also unpack that. HBC tool. So React Native these days, Facebook has released a new encoder called Hermes.js. So they're going to actually encode your JavaScript code into something called Hasm, which is Hermes assembly or WebAssembly, right? It's a version of WebAssembly, but you can also decompile that. So you should try your best to at least decompile all of these complicated code. You shouldn't waste time trying to read it. You should decompile that, unpack that. But if you cannot do that if there is no packer that is available to you, at the very least, you should run Link Finder, right? Link Finder is a tool that helps you extract all the API endpoints or URLs in a JavaScript source code. So that will at least help you give you more information about what's available. And if you're looking at GraphQL or common API frameworks, there's also stuff for you to introspect the API. So if you look at GraphQL, there's the introspection query. Don't just stop at the introspection query. That mostly might not be considered a vulnerability. You want to run the introspection query, and then you can pass the output of that into parsers. I think GraphQL Explorer is a very popular one. Paste the output from that query into that. This gives you the entire playground for you to test every single query very easily. If you're looking at OpenAPI, look for the Swagger UI. Most times, if it's a development environment, they will have the Swagger endpoint. If you're looking at Apollo, which is a kind of a wrapper around GraphQL, they will give you suggestions, because by default, they'll ask you, like, if you enter the wrong query, they'll be like, oh, did you mean this similar looking query, right? So you should automate that as well, so they can enumerate the entire GraphQL spec. And you should also check out for a playground, because Apollo comes with GraphQL playground that will then give you the entire GraphQL spec. So this is some recon that you can do. And if you don't really have a framework, it's just a generic API that they built custom. There's always error busting, but you should always look for documentation as well. That's also an underrated way. So when you approach an API, when you look at an application and you see an API being called, try to map every single thing out. Don't just test it in Burp Suite, but record that maybe in a YAML Open API spec, because then you can pass that into a fuzzer or a automated desk tool, which I'll talk about later. And of course, finally, you should keep an eye out for third-party integrations, right? So I think I've posted some of these exploits on my blog, but there are certain ways that people implement cloud integrations that can be exploited. From resource enumeration, there are tools like Let It Go and Recon.cloud. They are customized for Azure and AWS. So they're really good at identifying, oh, this user uses other buckets, or they might have another elastic load balancer endpoint somewhere else. This will at least expand from just a single scope. The second thing you should look at is naming patterns, right? Not just buckets, but also stuff like simple notification system, service, naming patterns, because all of this will give you more service to attack. And the third thing is role permissions, right? Because every single cloud call has to use a role, and sometimes they misconfigure this role. So you might want to learn more about how cloud role authorization can be exploited. And the third thing is software as a service. So dangling URLs, short link services. I know people who love exploiting short link services because by definition, you're supposed to generate a short link, so it's a very small search space. You can just brute force that really quickly. and that might give you some information disclosure. And finally, because for a lot of these third-party integrations, they are integrated as an iframe, so there's a lot of client-side attacks you can do, from CORS to post-message misconfigurations. I think I've written about that in solving DOM XSS puzzles. So these are all interesting things you can look out for. And so I'm not going to go too deep into this. I'm just going to have this one slide. But reverse engineering is a highly underrated skill in bug bounty. I think not enough people do that. They just try to do a black box thing. But these days, honestly, nothing is really black box. You really do have a gray box that you can work with. Try to work with Frida, Radare, Hydra. These are all the tools that are free and available for you. They'll be able to get you a much deeper insight into the workings of an application. And the things I've seen that people come out with that is just amazing. Yeah. So that's just that. So we're moving to the test. How can you automate testing as a manual bug bounty hunter, right? And back in 2020, I like to talk about my spreadsheet method, kind of a very simple way, right? When I start an application, I'll open Burp, and then I also have a spreadsheet at the side. And then I'll just use the features in the application, see what calls are logged in my Burp Suite, and I'll manually test them. And I'll write down, row by row each query I've made. And that makes me, that was the method I used back in 2019, 2020. And there's some positives to this, right? Firstly, it's very thorough, extremely thorough. Make sure that you check every single call, every single endpoint for every single thing, right? Even if you think there's no way it's going to be like SSRF or related to that, you should at least try just to check something out. So it makes you test for very interesting payloads. And it's also customized for each context because each spreadsheet belongs to one application. And it's also easy to bootstrap, right? You can just get started, open your Burp, open your Excel sheet, and that's all you need. But when I move to part-time hunting, where I only have a few hours a week, it's impossible to do this. It's very time-consuming. It's extremely slow, it's inconsistent, and the worst part is that it's not codified. And what do I mean by that? Every time you test an app, maybe you try something different, right? But you're not starting from the same space. And when you try something different and it works on the application, you don't record that, it gets lost in time. And so you lose a lot of these extra learnings, extra payloads that you might have used in one application from another. And that makes it very difficult for you to scale because in the end of the day, you are starting from scratch with every single application. So one thing I really recommend these days is that for bug bounty hunters to look at DevSecOps, right? So for DevSecOps, it's a way for companies, organizations, developers to automate their workflow whenever they create a code and automatically scan it for vulnerabilities and then deploy it to the cloud. But as a bug bounty hunter, you should also use these DevSecOps pipelines. Not just, it's not really to develop anything, but to find bugs, right? So on the static side of things, you should use stuff like semgrep, CodeQL. I haven't really looked at AppShark, but I intend to at least do some static code analysis on the things that you see. On the dynamic side of things, you should run some fuzzers, right? Cluster Fuzzlight, Wrestler. Gyrus is not really a fuzzer, but it's more of a signature-based scanner. But you should be doing all of these things because these will help surface bugs. And I would say that among these tools that I've recommended here, there's a commonality, and that is that it allows you to write your own custom rules, right? To write your own custom signatures. Especially for the dynamic side of things, fuzzing is really, really important. And I'll talk about that why now. When you're looking at stuff like huge code bases, maybe an iOS or a React Native application, that's typically a big file, right? For a lot of these semgrep and CodeQL scanners, they allow you to automatically identify vulnerable sources and sinks. So you want to start with a source, right, where user input comes in. Maybe it's a deep link, maybe it's a query parameter. And then because you have the source code, it will show you where this data passes through the code. Every single function call, where does it go? And that helps you track the flow of data through this application. Now, for a lot of developers, this is usually bad for them because when I use this in a DevSecOps pipeline, this gives you a lot of false positives. So for developers, they hate that because they're like, why are you wasting my time? I want to write code. But as a hacker, this is awesome. You don't really care about that because you as a hacker, you are the human, you understand the context. You're able to contextualize a lot of these false positives, and this will give you a lot of interesting data. And this helps you manually verify the sanitizers and transformations. So does this data get sanitized? Does this data get transformed somewhere else? And then you manually write the proof of concept. So I think for DevSecOps, it's really interesting because for developers, what might be bad for developers in the DevSecOps pipeline is actually great for you as a hacker. So you should keep an eye out on all of these tools and try to implement them in your pipelines. And after you've kind of built out this pipeline for yourself, the secret sauce is your curated custom rules. Don't spray and pray. Don't just use default rules, right? You want to look for app-specific sources, app-specific syncs and responses, and this will all be accumulated in your corpus of battle-tested rules over time. And so what does this mean, right? When you first test an application, sure, you can just open it up in Burp and test it out. But after a while, you should just use your safe Burp project, extract out all these endpoints for the API, and then you should codify that maybe into an open API specification. And with that, you can then pass it into like an automatic scanner, right? A lot of these scanners, they don't just support open API, they also support stuff like HAR files, which is a HTTP archive, I think, which basically are able to build this context for you as well. And then you'll run these scanners, and then you'll come out with these possible bugs, a lot of false positives, but that's where you come in as a manual bug bounty hunter, because you are best at this job, so you should be triaging them manually. So you don't have to be worried about false positives. In a DevSecOps pipeline, you want to reduce the number of false positives, but as a bug bounty hunter, you kind of want to focus more on the true positives. So even if there are a lot of false positives, as long as your true positives are increasing, that's something you should look out for. And finally, for exploitation. So how many of you have used the CSRF POC generator? Burp Suite? Yeah, I see all of you guys, and I always kind of like delete the generated by Burp Suite, before I put in my report, a bit embarrassing. But nothing to be embarrassed about, right? Because I think it's a great example of exploit generation. It's something that, why should you be writing this HTML by yourself all the time, right? No, you should just use a generator. And as a manual hunter, you're gonna come across a lot of these bugs, but you're not gonna automate that enough, right? Because, Burp, they built that feature for you, but you should build that feature for other bugs. Start relying on manual, right? So one case study is that recently I was testing a bug bounty target that looked at ebook files. So ebook is EPUB, right? And it was very difficult because I had to upload the EPUB file and then you'll run a bunch of things on that. And I was hoping I could get an SSRF from there, right? And one of the available repositories out there is called Evo EPUB. So it's a list, it's basically a huge repository filled with EPUB payloads. And you might see that with other things like SVGs or like PNGs or a bunch of other exploits. But they tend to be already built for you, and that's not a good way to do it. You should write a script to generate these payloads instead, right? So you look at all of these repositories, look at what was generated, and try to understand where these exploits are coming from so that you can write a script to generate these payloads. Locate the exploit primitives. So I noticed that for the EPUB payloads, they were trying to test for SSRF by using everything from HTTP leaks, which is another payload done by Cure53, right? So you should use that, write the generation scripts. And for me, this was really useful because then I was able to automate and write a script that would generate a new payload every time, submit that to the technically vulnerable service. And this was much easier than me going to the website, uploading the EPUB file, and then hoping for something to happen. And because I automated this, I was able to send hundreds of payloads, in a few minutes, and I was able to get my blind SSRF, right? So again, this is another way that manual bug bounty hunters should use automation in their tooling. As a manual bug bounty hunter, you can use tools like DOM Invader. I'm a big fan of Post Message Tracker. That's another good one that you can use, but these are client-side extensions in the browser for like Chrome or Firefox that allow you to also identify stuff. So when DOM Invader came out for Burp Suite, I think it's a Burp Pro extension or something, but I was really excited about it because it's another good example of exploit automation, right? Because it's able to find the sources and syncs in a client-side JavaScript code, and then if you want to exploit it, it's going to give you a button to click exploit. You click exploit and I think it'll generate the payload for you, and you can automate and use that. And that's really useful because when you look at the client-side code and you run source-to-sync tracing, sometimes it can be very, very difficult to just recreate the exploit. So I really want to share a bug I found recently. I'll try to make it into a blog post as well because I don't have permission to disclose it yet. But basically, writing the manual payload took ages, even though finding it was really easy. And this is something that you should be automating yourself. So what I recommend is actually, if you have access, you should look at the source code of stuff like Post Message Tracker, because that's open source, right? You should look at how DOM Invader was built and get familiar with automating client-side code extensions. And really, as a manual bug bounty hunter, you have a very different tool set, because the automation kings, they're going to be like just running scanners, they're going to be server-side stuff. But you're going to be browsing through the application. You're going to be logging all of that in your Burp Suite project. And this is a rich source of data, right? You're wondering, what should I do with this saved project file, right? What you should be doing is extracting a lot of the contextual information, such as maybe the APIs, the endpoints, maybe some of the headers that are used in your Burp Suite requests. And you should be thinking about how you can utilize this in automation pipelines. So again, as I mentioned earlier, you should probably be feeding this into a dynamic scanner or API fuzzer, because that will really help you supercharge your workflow. So at the end of the day, I think you don't really need to spin your own recon framework, right? Everyone's writing their own recon framework. I think there are at least more than 10 like open source recon frameworks, and a lot of these hunters also have their own custom frameworks that they're not going to open source. And the difference here is that you should be focusing on maybe writing and hosting your own exploit services. So stuff like interact.sh, they're really good open source tools to test for blind SSRF, but you can also write your own XSS hunter. I think the reason why is because these days, a lot of these services, they're all easily blocked by webs, right? And some of them even hard code for XSS hunter and for interact.sh or like Burp collaborator. So you should actually write your own you should host your own Burp collaborator server, or you should also write your own XSS hunter and host your own exploit services. Because I think for XSS hunter, one thing that has been observed as well is that the payload is a bit too big. The kind of stuff they extract so might not be compatible with some browsers. So you have to write your own minimal blind XSS payload so that you can confirm it, but also you won't be caught by webs, you won't be caught by hard-coded defenses. And also, I think you should start writing your own things. One thing that a lot of people miss is that they use XSS hunter, and because of the lack of compatibility, they don't get a callback. But actually, people who have been using their own blind XSS payloads, they're able to get their own callback, and then they get the bug. So in order to differentiate yourself as a manual bug bounty hunter, you should be writing these services. But I'd like to just summarize to you what modern manual bug hunting should look like. It shouldn't just be Burp Suite and then nothing else, right? You should be starting to add your own scripting and automation. And one easy way to recognize that is that if you find yourself doing the same thing again and again, from dir busting to injection tests, to off-Z tests, to source-to-sink tracing, and finally to payloads, it's time to automate, right? And I really, if you look back at the quote that James Cattle wrote about, like, we shouldn't be looking for vulnerabilities, we should be looking for interesting behavior. That sounds a lot like fuzzing. And fuzzing isn't applied enough in bug bounty, because in bug bounty, people look at web, they look at mobile, they look at APIs, they don't really look at native. I think now there are more native bug bounties, and especially for stuff like point-to-own and stuff like that. But even for web and mobile and API, fuzzing is actually your secret power, because what a fuzzing pipeline involves is that it requires someone at the end of the day to verify the crashes, to verify the signatures, and that's where you as a manual bug bounty hunter come in. So definitely I think when it comes to the entire workflow, so I've gone through recon to testing to exploit and how you can add automation there. Manual hunters, rather than trying to beat automation kings at their own game, you should focus on your strengths. Your goal is to complement your workflow, not to replace it. So when it comes to recon, I've showed ways that you can automate expanding from a single scope into a huge amount of resources, third-party services, software as a services that you can use. And then when you go to the testing stage, rather than testing every single endpoint yourself, which maybe as a bug bounty hunter you might still do, but you should also have someone to double-check your work, right? And that person is not a person, it's a machine, right? Because a machine is reproducible, it's able to codify your knowledge, so that if maybe one day you mistype a payload or you forget to test something, at least you are having a backup script at the end of the day that's testing for those things that you might have missed. So you know at least that you are free to do whatever you would like to do, which is manual bug bounty hunting, but you have that backup. And when it comes to exploit, like I said, writing that script to automate my ebook payloads was awesome, because then rather than manually uploading every single time a new payload, I could just send hundreds of these payloads at a time, check that out and see if I get a ping back, right? So you should start thinking about scripting your exploits. You should start thinking about tools like DOM Invader and how that works, and then trying to reverse engineer that, build your own. And finally, that hopefully helps you have more fun and profit, right? So I hope this really short talk, but really I think I try to cover the bases as much as possible, have given you, whether you're automation king or manual bug bounty hunter, more ideas about how you can implement these workflows. Because I think there's too much of a divide, but there's a lot of things you can do to improve yourself as a manual bug bounty hunter and to focus on what you like to do best, which is just manual exploitation. So yeah, thank you. I'm not sure there's time for questions, but thank you very much.